Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Patterson, and I have to look at my own notes to remember who I am because I'm also nervous, as Anna. I'm a research investigator at the Survey Research Center, and I was an NIA PSC postdoc with Bob just before that. I'd like to thank ISR for holding this memorial. It means a lot as his student, and also the committee that put it together. So I just want to start with a couple of thoughts about Bob, a story about Bob, and then I'll introduce the intergenerational transfers presentations and Discussant. So I think one of the things that I've taken away that I had made these notes, but I think today has just reinforced, is that Bob's presence sort of permeates all of our lives and continues to do so. From our teaching to our mentoring to our individual relationships with each other. I think we keep a little piece of Bob with us everywhere we go in all of our activities. And because of all the mentees and co-authors he's had all over the world, that means there's little pieces of Bob here with us. There's little pieces of Bob in California, in Texas, Georgia, Colombia, South Korea, the UK, Canada, and Turkey. I told this story at PAA, and it's like one of my favorite memories of Bob. So I actually applied twice to get the PSC postdoc. I got it on the second try, so keep, persist. And I had applied to work with Bob both times. And so Bob helped me figure out where to live. He's speaking of spreadsheets. He helped me with the spreadsheets of Ann Arbor neighborhoods and the bus line, and I wanted to be on the bike paths. And so I ended up actually in a neighborhood near Gretchen and Bob, and there's a little Dairy Queen. And I had just started, and I really, wanted to be taken seriously, and really thought, I was like, this is a really important opportunity in my life. But the first couple of weeks, speaking of, being a postdoc, it's like just getting acclimated and knowing people. So there was one day where I just was sort of feeling a little defeated, and I was like, I'm just gonna go home, and the Dairy Queen's on my way to my house. And so I got off the bus, and it's like a beautiful day, and I got a chocolate milkshake, which is obviously not important, but I just wanted to tell you in case anybody's curious. I know we're all data people in this room, so I was walking down the street with my chocolate milkshake, just starting to feel better, and up the street, up Packard, comes Bob, and he had just been coaching, and I got really embarrassed because I was like, I want to be taken seriously, and I'm over here midday, just walking with a milkshake. But Bob lit up, he was genuinely really happy to see me, and we maybe spent 2 seconds talking about my PSID papers, and then we spent the rest of the time talking about ice cream, which was really fun, and just made me feel really at ease. So I wanted to build on something that Gretchen had mentioned about Bob, which is carpe diem. And I never took Latin, so please forgive me for this, but I would encourage all of us to carpe glacius crepito, or seize the ice cream. So for this final session, we're going to talk about intergenerational transfers. We're going to start with Adriana Reyes, who's an assistant professor of policy analysis and management, and as well as in sociology at Cornell. She was an NIA postdoc here at the PSC with Bob. And then we'll have Emily Wiemers, who's an associate professor of public administration and international affairs, Syracuse. She was a PSID and PSC postdoc. There's so many acronyms for everyone with Bob here at the University of Michigan. And then we'll get concluding thoughts from Fabian Pfeffer, who's an associate professor of sociology and director of the Stone Center for Inequality here at U of M. And with Bob, he was a faculty research fellow here at ISR. So without further ado, I'll let Adriana take it away. Thank you.
Right. Thank you for that introduction, Sarah, and thanks to all the organizers for putting together this beautiful memorial. I'm so grateful to be a part of it. And when I was asked to share some of my work, I actually decided to share some work with Sarah. Highlighting work with two of his mentees. And so I'll be presenting on this paper that we have been working on in progress, looking at the dynamics of family exchanges across the later life course. And I thought it would be fitting to kind of really start just talking about some of Bob's contributions to our understanding of intergenerational transfers, as a leader in this area of study, using both the health and retirement study and the panel study of income dynamics to study these general patterns that accounted for the transfer of time and money. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of his work and kind of use that to also talk about how our work kind of fits in and contributes further to this area that's kind of grown a lot, since Bob's early work in this area. And I'll highlight some of his key contributions. And, in looking and preparing for this, I noticed that these papers that he worked on, over 2 decades ago are still being cited today and have, some of them over 500 citations. And so just to really point out, the impact he's made on the field in this area has been really long lasting. And so I'll kind of, some of the kind of highlights that I want to talk about are his work highlighting that, that parents are more likely to give to transfers to children who are less well off. How common transfers are, looking at both time and money in exchanges, that young adults are actually more likely to receive than older adults. And again, that this, parents with more income are more likely to give more. And I'll talk about these in greater details. And so, in his work and in this field of looking at intergenerational transfers, I want to talk a little about these theoretical models of transfers, because I think they're, important for the study that I'll be talking about, and come also in the work that he found as well. And so altruism is, one of the key models that people talk about in terms of why are there these intergenerational exchanges between parents and their children? And this is the idea that parents are going to help children when they need it, and help those who need it more. In contrast to altruism is this idea of exchange or reciprocity, and this is the idea that parents are going to provide assistance for their children, and then maybe in return children are going to provide assistance to them later in life, and that there's this exchange element between these transfers that are exchanged. And then finally is this idea of a family insurance model, that these exchanges operate to smooth out hardships like unemployment and other types of hardships. And so in his work, Bob largely was testing out altruism and using the relationship between the income of givers and recipients to test out whether or not this held true. And in one of his early papers on intergenerational transfers, when he found that parents help children with the greatest need, he noted that the negative relationship with the recipient income and the receipt of transfers to both adult children as well as older parents, suggesting that respondents are helping those who have the greatest need, and within families that parents are more likely to give more to less well-off children compared to those doing better. And so these findings support, the idea that altruism is really motivating these transfers, because, the help is going to those who have the greatest need. And a follow-up paper using the panel study of income dynamics, Bob examines transfers of money and time, and he finds, this is where he finds that the pervasiveness of transfers being, 60% of households are receiving time or money, or receiving or giving. And he demonstrates, the importance of studying these transfers for how common they are, as well as, documenting the importance of these transfers for things like intergenerational mobility and wealth. And not only that, he notes a strong age gradient in these transfers, decreasing with age until about age 55, and then increasing again. But that still young adults receive about twice as much transfers as older adults in their 70s. And he finds again that those with less income receive more, providing some evidence of altruism. But he also notes that the nonlinear relationship and the small size of the income effect suggests that transfers are more motivated by more than just altruism. And so kind of leaves this door open for thinking about these other potential motivations for these transfers. And building on this work, in one of his most highly cited, papers in this area, he really looked at the magnitude of these exchanges for young adults and how important they are to young adults. Noting that the size is large, that they on average are receiving, $2,000 from their parents annually, that there's a big income gradient, and that parents, in the top quartile are giving 3 times as much compared to those in the bottom quartile. And in this study, he also notes the increasing number of young adults living with their parents over time, noting the importance of co-residence as a form of intergenerational exchanges. And this trend of increasing co-residence has only continued in the time since this study. And so, really one of the first kind of markers of the importance of understanding co-residence as a key form of intergenerational transfers, which then it really comes out in our study as well, given how common this form of intergenerational exchange is. And so he was really, a leader in this area. And so, how does our work build on this? Well, our research questions build on this to assess the relationship between intergenerational transfers from parents to their children and their relationship with later life caregiving. And so specifically, we ask, are parents more likely to expect future assistance from children if they provide intergenerational support to them? And then second, are children who received intergenerational support from their parents as adults more likely to provide care assistance when parents have an onset of need? And so, building on this work, noting that transfers are likely motivated by more than just altruism, one of the key contributions of this study is trying to leverage data on the expectations of future help that parents report to help us tease out this idea of whether or not these exchanges are altruistically motivated, or whether or not they're part of an exchange model between parents and families, and this idea of reciprocity. And because, in a lot of work trying to look at these intergenerational transfers have noted the importance of thinking about exchanges and reciprocity across the life course, this life course reciprocity model. And so in order to try to capture this idea that exchanges might play out over a longer period of time, we're utilizing longitudinal data and looking at the onset of health conditions to assess help received at a time when it's needed. And so we're trying to use that as a way to get at when parents need help, are they actually going to get it based off of these prior transfers? And so here's our model for how we're thinking about how we're going to tease out this altruistic exchange versus the reciprocal exchanges between parents and children. So if intergenerational transfers are motivated by altruism, then we would expect no relationship between parents' assistance of children and their expectation of future care from that child. And we would expect children to provide care regardless of whether or not they received assistance from their parents as young adults. On the other hand, if transfers are part of an implied exchange in these parent-child dyads, then we would expect parents to be more likely to expect future help from children who they gave transfers to, and children would be more likely to provide assistance to parents who provided support to them as young adults and prior to this onset. And so to study this, we are using 20 years of data from the health and retirement study. I imagine many people here are familiar with it, so I won't spend too much time talking about it. But importantly, we're using the parent-child dyads as the unit of analysis to look at this relationship of intergenerational exchanges. And we're limiting our sample to parents with living children, and we're only using children that are 18 and older, and those for parents who we observe the onset of health limitations, so we can get the time ordering of the exchanges before the onset and after the onset. So we have two dependent variables in our model. So the first is caregiving expectations, and this is measured prior to the onset. and it asked parents, would this child be willing and able to help with basic personal care activities over a long period of time if the respondent needed it? And so so then if for each parent-child dyad, we're coding, if parent says that that child would be willing and able, then that is a 1 and otherwise a 0. And then for help with ADLs and IADLs, we're measuring this after, at the onset. So when the parents first report having an ADL and an IADL separately, does the child help the parent with any of these, these ADLs? And then for the IADLs, does the child help with those? And again, measuring this at the onset, we've done some sensitivity looking, if they ever help, even after the onset, and the results are pretty similar. So I'll just be talking about these results at the onset. So we have our dependent variable here is in this model then is the time and the caregiving. And in both of our models of expectations and for time, our key independent variable is these transfers from the parents to the children. And so we're looking at time through grandchild care. And so the question asked of whether or not the respondent has provided over 100 hours of care for a grandchild. And then we're looking at the financial transfers, which are more than $500. And then we're looking at co-residence, which we are only looking at prior to the onset. And so a key part of this is the time ordering of when these measures are coming from. And I should also mention these, for looking at these transfers from parents to children, we're looking at cumulatively from as young adults, so from age 18 to prior to the onset of these health conditions. And we're controlling for a wide set of parent characteristics that and child dyad characteristics that are also associated with the need for help, as well as the availability of children. And so considering these socio-demographic characteristics and importantly in thinking about the availability of children, which is another area that I've worked on with Bob. We're trying to control for proximity of the children, as well as how many children there are in the family, as well as in these other factors that are important for predicting whether or not children provide care. So in the analysis, we're using a simple basic logistic regression model here, and looking at the cumulative assistance given to the children before the onset of health limitations, predicting, looking at expectations of future help first to kind of get at this idea of whether or not the parents' assistance is motivated by their expectations for help later in the life course. And then at the onset of ADLs and IADLs, does the child help with the limitation? Are the children's actual helping behavior motivated again by these previous transfers? And so this is just kind of looking at how many of these this help is somewhat common. Not all children help at the onset, but we do observe quite a few children helping, and we do see some patterns in help by gender and race. And so we also do test, and I won't share too much results from this, but we do also look at some differences across SES and race as well. So what motivates exchanges? Are parents more likely to expect future assistance from their children if they provide intergenerational support to them? So in our model, we find in a model not controlling without controls, we find strong evidence that each type of co-resident of transfer, and we also look if they're in the will at FB+, we see this relationship that it does appear to be that parents have greater expectations of help from children who they have provided these transfers to in the past. And then once we control for these social and demographic characteristics, we see that only ever co-resided and ever provided childcare to a grandchild are significant once we account for all of these other characteristics of the parent and child dyad. And so, this suggests that, co-residence and providing childcare appear to have give parents, a stronger sense of expectations of future help if they're providing this type of help to their children. Providing childcare is very time intensive for parents, and so this seems to kind of provide greater expectations of future support than financial transfer or being in the will. So, this suggests that parent transfers are motivated by reciprocity. They're more likely to expect future assistance when they have provided co-residence or grandchild care prior to the onset of these limitations. So now looking at the other side, what motivates children to provide care? Looking at our children who received these intergenerational supports, more likely to provide assistance. And first, looking at ADLs, we find that without controls, only ever co-resided is significant. And so it seems that, just providing these other types of transfers do not indicate a stronger sense of, needing to provide care or obligation. Although once we add in controls, we do see that ever making a financial transfer does appear to be significant. So there might be some suppression effect there that, that indeed that there is a relationship between these financial transfers and help with ADLs. And because, we're using this onset of ADLs to be a marker of need for care and thinking about whether or not then this reciprocity plays out, we do a further test by looking at a sample of unmarried parents who maybe have a greater need for help from their children because they don't have a spouse. And we largely find similar results here, although we don't see this effect for financial transfer. Instead, we just see this strong effect of ever co-resided on children being more likely to provide help at the onset of ADLs. Now turning to IADLs, we see, in this uncontrolled model here, we see more of these characteristics, or more of these transfers are associated with children providing support. So we see a significant and a large effect for co-residence again, but we also see this child providing child care and being in the will as also being significant. And again, then with our controls, then all four types of intergenerational exchanges are significantly associated with providing help with IADLs at onset. Again, we look at this in an unmarried sample, and we find, very, very similar, almost identical results here, with again this large effect for co-residence, but still substantial and significant effects for providing childcare, making financial transfers, and being included in the will for help with IADLs at the onset. So this suggests that children's care assistance is, at least partially motivated by this idea of reciprocity, especially for help with IADLs, since all four exchanges are associated with providing assistance with IADLs. However, only co-residence is associated with providing assistance with ADLs. I'll try to talk about that in the discussion. So I mentioned too that, we did some work looking at differences across groups, and we don't find differences in motivation by SES, in thinking about what motivates these types of exchanges. We do find a small race effect that Hispanic parents' expectations are not associated with transfer, so that there may be a more altruistic outlook for Hispanic parents in providing exchanges and their expectations that we're still exploring. And then another, interesting finding that we found is that reciprocity from co-residence is declining across cohorts for both expectations and care provided. So although co-residence has become more common, it's actually the effect is getting smaller over time in terms of whether or not parents expect help and whether or not children actually provide assistance over time. So overall, our results, find the strong support for this idea that there are these elements of reciprocity that are important in these intergenerational exchanges. That parents and children, do seem to be operating with this idea that the exchanges are made with some implicit understanding that maybe they will get help if they need it. As parents are more likely to expect future assistance from children that they provide co-residence assistance to and childcare assistance specifically. And children are more likely to provide care assistance to aging parents with ADLs when they have previously co-resided and, for any type for IADL support. So we mainly, find support for reciprocity. We find that co-residence is especially influential, with it being significant in all of our models and by far having the largest effect size. So, we kind of have, in thinking about this, we are, hypothesizing that the reason why co-residence is so important is not only the exchange and the help that's received through co-residence, but there's also maybe a relationship closeness that is forged through sharing a household for a longer period of time that may be important too, and understanding why they might be more willing to provide care later in life. And so expanding, and part of the motivation for this paper is kind of thinking about, what will motivate some children to provide care and others not to, and thinking, expanding beyond just what family are available, but thinking about what are these motivations. And what we find here in this paper is that intergenerational exchanges across the life course, shape these caregiving expectations and care receipt. And so these are really kind of started earlier in the life course before parents really have this onset. There is both this expectations and this family dynamics that are playing out and are going to lead to different patterns later in life for caregiving. And so that's what we have found in our paper, and I just want to end with a thank you, and I look forward to questions. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. It's a complete pleasure and honor to be here. I have had the disadvantage of having to be nervous for much longer than everybody else, but the advantage of being able to see some connections between my work and other people's work, and it was wonderful to present after Adriana, who sort of set up so many things for me. Today I'm going to talk about parental resources, and I should say who I am. I'm Emily Wiemers. I was a mentee of Bob during my postdoc here at PSID and at PSC. I actually first met Bob in my second year of my PhD program in an incredibly nerdy exchange that involved PSID attrition, the Martha Hill relationship file, and weights. And so I think he sort of transmitted the love of sort of being in the weeds in data to me from very early time. So I'm going to talk today about some work that I've done with many colleagues on parental resources and children's educational decisions. And you'll notice there's no names on the slide, and that's because the people who've been involved, there's too many and they wouldn't fit. So this draws on some work, data collection work that I was very fortunate to, that actually came out of my postdoc here, that I was very fortunate to be a part of with Bob, Suzanne Bianchi, Judy Seltzer, Joe Hotz, and Vicki Friedman. And then the analysis that I'm going to talk about is joint work with Joe Hotz and two of his PhD students at Duke that I was really lucky to work with, Joshua Rasmussen and Kate Kegel, and then some other work that I'm doing with one of my own graduate students, who's named Ken Chang at Syracuse. Let's see. Uh-oh. Sorry. Okay, here we go. We were lucky enough to get funding to do this. Okay, so I'm going to talk about three different research questions. One, I'm going to talk about the influence of parental wealth and income on whether children attend college, whether parents help finance it, and then whether kids graduate. I'm gonna talk about whether the influence of parental wealth and income on college attendance and financing decisions varies between Black and white families. And then I'm gonna talk a little bit about how parental wealth and income affect kids' educational expectations. And this work comes directly out of Bob's work with other mentees on the role that parents play in this transition to adulthood. So in work with Patrick Whiteman, they showed that 65% of adults between age 19 and 22 report receiving financial support, and that they receive considerable support conditional on receiving about $12,000 on average. And in the work that Adriana also cited with Karen Ross, he shows that if you add up all that stuff that kids get between the ages of 18 and 34, it's quite sizable, about $47,000, and that this varies a lot based on the resources that parents and kids have. That parents have. In particular, what I'm going to focus on today is parents' role in financing their kids' college. So this is just an infographic from Sally Mae that talks about how people pay for college. And about 34% of the costs on average are covered by parental income and savings. Parents also borrow money to pay for kids' college. About 10% of the costs are covered by parental borrowing. But even among students who borrow, a lot of them, 1 in 3, say that their parents are going to share some responsibility for paying those bills. This fits into a very long literature looking at the role of parental resources on these educational decisions. I think the most recent literature says that parents' income does affect whether kids attend college, and especially as the cost of college has gone up. And there's a separate literature on housing wealth that kind of says that increases in housing wealth in particular increase college attendance, increase the quality of college attended, and increase kids' income in adulthood. But there's very little work that says how that happens. How does parental income and wealth actually affect kids' college attendance decisions? And that's partially because there wasn't a lot of data available that asked parents what they actually gave to their kids to pay for college. So that's where this paper is going to come in, looking at this mechanism of parental financial transfers for college and how parental income and wealth affect the financial transfers that they give. And I should say that I think this is newly relevant, given that we've seen really large changes in both income and in housing wealth during the pandemic. So this is from Pew, which just shows that in the first year of the pandemic, there were declines in income for everyone, but that the declines were much larger for families at the bottom of the income distribution relative to families at the top of the income distribution. But at the same time, this is something that's highlighted in the New York Times last week, there's been an incredible boom in housing wealth, right? Because of the increase in housing prices, homeowners have much more home equity than they did before. And so in a certain sense, this is a flow of resources that could go to students to help them pay for college. But there are also increasingly people who are locked out of that housing market because the increase in prices have meant it's difficult to buy your first home, for example. When I thought about what to present, I tried to figure out something that would allow me to use as much PSID data as possible, because that was such a big part of my training with Bob. And so I think I haven't hit everything. Dust isn't in here, but I've managed to use lots of everything else. So the core piece of data that we're going to start with is the PSID roster and transfers module, in which PSID respondents are asked about the educational attainment of their adult children and the transfers that they gave those children for post-secondary schooling since they were age 18. We link this then with data from the core that gives us information on home ownership, the home value, family income, family characteristics, and home equity loans. I'm not going to talk about debt today, but in this project, we also link it with stuff that we know about parents and kids' debt. Then in the project that I'll present little bits of in my work with Kent, Chang, looking at expectations, we use the transition to adulthood supplement, in which young adults are asked about their educational expectations. And we use the child development supplement in order to link those kids to their high school grades and some measures of achievement tests. We then use the geocoded data so that we can link all of that to the housing market and labor market in which parents and kids live when kids are 16 years old. And to do that, we use data, external data from Zillow and the FHFA, and local employment and wage data from the QCEW. So we basically take a group of people who, a group of children who were reported on in 2013. And from that, we know how much schooling they have and how much money their parents gave them. And then we go back and we find them when they were age 18 and link them to the characteristics of the household that they grew up in. And then we link forward to look at whether they graduated, for example, from college, and also in stuff I won't show, to look at indebtedness outcomes for both kids and parents. Just so that I'm an economist, so I have to have some notation. It's impossible not to do it. We're going to sort of think about kids and parents as making a choice where the kid can either go to college, not go to college, go to college with no help from parents, or go to college with help from parents. And then for those who attend college, we just measure whether they graduate or not. And the two main things we're going to look at is housing wealth. So that's net home equity in the year the kid is 18, which is reported in the PSID, and parental income when the kid was 18. So that's H and Y. Again, I'm an economist, so forgive me. But what we're going to do is very simple. We're just going to use a multinomial logit model where we control for a bunch of characteristics about kids and their parents. And we also control for a bunch of characteristics about the local labor markets in which kids and parents live. And for graduation, we're going to do something similar where we look at whether kids graduate as a function of income and wealth, controlling for a bunch of other stuff. Of course, income and wealth are endogenous, right? And so we need to think about external measures of income and wealth that are uncorrelated with, they're correlated with parents' wealth, but uncorrelated with all the unobservables about income and wealth that we might be worried about. And so we use sort of a technique that's been used many times before in the literature, where we think about using as a measure of parental wealth, the equity that they sort of gained in their home in the 4 years between the time that the kid was age 14 and the kid was age 18, based on where they live and how much housing appreciated in that local market. And we do the same thing with local wages. So we use changes in local wages in your local labor market as sort of a external measure of parental income. And what do we find? So remember that what we're trying to uncover here is the mechanism. So if parental transfers are one mechanism through which parental wealth and income affect kids' outcomes, then we should see that when income goes up, that you sort of have a greater likelihood of attending college with transfers, not just a greater likelihood of attending college overall, right? And we see exactly this. So we see that when parental wealth goes up, the likelihood of a kid attending college with a parental transfer goes up by a small amount, about 1/3 of a percentage point. When parental income goes up by $10,000, we see an increase in the likelihood that kids attend college, again, with help from their parents. That goes up by about 1.63 percentage points. And the likelihood of not going to college at all declines by 2 percentage points. So we see no action in the likelihood of going without money from your parents, only in the likelihood that you go to college with help from your parents. We also see that increases in wealth, but not income, affect the likelihood of graduation. And in work that I'm not going to show you, we actually show that part of this is that parents don't start to accumulate home equity loans or additional housing debt until about 2 years after their children have matriculated. So at age 18, we don't really see any action in parents being more likely to take on home equity loans. That only happens when the kid sort of is 20 or 22, suggesting that it might be that parents and kids wait to see whether college is going to work out, whether they're going to be successful before sort of tapping into these sort of slightly more expensive and more difficult forms of payment. We then ask whether these differences vary between Black and white families. And here I want to sort of draw on what Angel said before. So here we're looking at whether we see different impacts of wealth and housing wealth and income on the educational financing decisions that kids make. And part of the goal is then to think about why we see the differences that we see. We would expect to see some differences because of the well-known Black-white wealth gap, and also because we know that Black students and Hispanic students take on more student debt in total. So just focusing on the homeowning parents, what we see is that for income, the effective income on parental kids' educational and financing decisions is quite similar between kids in Black and white families. So income increases the likelihood of both groups going to college with a transfer, and sort of reduces the likelihood of not going to college at all. But on the wealth side, we see very big differences. So we see that for kids of white parents, that having their parent gain an additional $10,000 in home equity during the time that they're sort of a teenager increases the likelihood that they go to college and that their parents give them money for it. But for Black families, we don't see any increase in the likelihood of going to college with a parental transfer. We only see increases in the likelihood of going to college without transfers. And so what we're doing now is using the fact that we know where everybody lives and the fact that banks have to report by race who they give loans to see if we can see evidence that these structural issues like discrimination in lending markets might be one reason why Black parents are maybe less able to translate home equity into paying for their kids to go to college. We're also trying to use the PSID to program the FAFSA and figure out what parents and kids might be eligible for in terms of financial aid. And so we're trying to sort of say this is the starting. This isn't telling us anything. What we need to know is why that's happening. And then finally, I just want to talk a little bit about how parental wealth and income affects educational aspirations and expectations for kids. This is part of a project where we're actually looking at a bigger set of expectations and not just educational expectations, but also early career expectations. But we use data that's collected in the Transition to Adulthood supplement to the PSID that asks the respondents how far they think they'll go in school. And we just code this as, 1 if they're going to graduate from college, if they think they're going to graduate from college, or do more than that, and 0 otherwise. And then we merge this with the rich data that we have from the CDS that tells us lots of stuff about that we know affect kids' expectations about schooling, including their high school grades and their test scores from the Woodcock-Johnson tests. And we also control for lots of family characteristics and demographics. And here, again, we find that even if you control, so I will say that your high school GPA and your test scores do a lot. They would do a lot of the work in sort of predicting kids' expectations about going to college. But even after you control for those things, there does appear to be some role of parental resources. So compared to kids in the bottom of whose parents are in the bottom of the distribution of home equity, kids who are in the top quartile, whose parents are in the top quartile are 10 percentage points more likely to say they expect to graduate from college. And this appears to be, again, a larger effect for white kids than for Black kids. In terms of income, we see more similar effects. We see a big effect of income, being in the 4th income quartile relative to the bottom increases the likelihood that you'll say you expect to graduate from college by between 16 and 20 percentage points. And these are more similar across the two, between Blacks and whites, which suggests, again, the same thing, that there may be some difference in the way that people are able to access the home equity to sort of increase educational expectations. So I'll just end by saying this is very, very preliminary work. And we're working on sort of using a similar identification strategy so that we can get at sort of causal effects on these expectations, and also to look at career expectations. Where one of the things we're interested in is whether kids whose parents have more resources are more likely to say that they want to get jobs and they don't kind of care how much they get paid relative to. So that's another thing that we're looking at. But we're also looking at the transfers that are reported in the Transition to Adulthood supplement, which will allow us to think about whether we also see evidence that the transfers are occurring. So I will end, I think, by just saying that I think one thing we haven't highlighted today, we've highlighted so many of Bob's contributions to all sorts of so many fields. And it's funny, when I looked at the list of mentees, I was like, I assign papers. I teach a class in demography, aging, and health, and I assign the papers of so many of his mentees that I didn't even know were his mentees. I think echoing what Rucker said. But one thing we haven't really highlighted is his huge contribution in terms of data collection and sort of seeing people, that's going to be an ongoing contribution to sort of the field, but also in some ways like a contribution to mentoring that will be there forever. So I was really lucky that he kind of showed me how that worked as a junior person. So thank you.
Okay, can you hear me fine? Excellent, great. So of course it speaks to the genius of the organizers that we end this day with a section on intergenerational transfers. And we've seen that Bob was a master of intergenerational transfer. We saw it in these two papers, I think in a very real way, the quality of that transfer. But I also want to pick up on that last point, right? The quantity is amazing too. Actually, there are demographers that study how intergenerational transmission works, and they figured out you also got to look at fertility. How many offspring do you transfer to? They figured out, for example, Genghis Khan was very effective, mostly through fertility. It's the only characteristic that Bob shares with Genghis Khan is that he's so prolific in his offspring in both quality and quantity. What's really striking to me is also this, that he defied most economists by showing that there is no quantity quality trade-off. You saw this right now. We see this in his mentoring, feeling like the only, Rucker said, like the only person that he cares about. Of course, he was wrong. I was his favorite. We've seen it in his professional life, in his own writing. It was only until I ran into some other person from a totally different field to say, you work with Bob, he's so prolific. And I realized, oh yeah, he's doing all this other stuff too. And in the end, also way beyond his professional life, right? He was a real mensch and always had time for people. You should have read the stories that the PSID staff sent around. Bob attending the hockey games of their children. Bob making room for ice cream. And then Bob going on family trips to Ohio, like the important stuff he always made time for. So no wonder that he was interested in time transfer. Somehow he must have gotten, time transfers, and he made it really count, even if we were hoping we had more time with him. So let me get to the two papers. Adriana and Sarah's paper is really wonderful. It picks up on a really large literature on this, debate about altruism and exchange that surprisingly always focused on how parents behave towards their children. And I think it's a really fundamental contribution to say, well, we should turn this around too. And if you read that theory closely, we sort of need to understand how the kids respond to that. So I think that's a wonderful idea to turn things around, and in many ways walking the walk of that literature. There is sort of challenges, of course. In the end, you acknowledge the relationship quality, right? The co-residence may be shaping relationship quality. Of course, others may say that is a reflection of relationship quality. Whether I let my parents spend time with my kids reflects relationship quality, and that may be driving these two. But overall, I would say Bob would be so happy to see this project because it really, in a very real way, follows up on his work and acknowledges that exchange goes both ways. And we learn something new from this new perspective. Here's some more ideas. So once you look at things from a new way, it brings up new opportunities. So these are mostly ideas for next papers. Studies of cultural transmission. So do the motives of the exchange from the parents to the kids, do those reflect the motives of the parent, the exchange from the kids to the parents? You get a part of that, but I think if you actually had motives measured in some ways, you could get at that. This cultural transmission idea, I think, also applies to the Hispanic finding that you mentioned. We know about familialism as a really important aspect. And I will end by saying Bob would be disappointed, of course, that you're not using the PSID for this. So, what could you do there? You could do this, I think, in a multi-generational way, which brings up really interesting other perspectives. You could think of the sandwich generation. There are now transfers up and down. Do those actually mirror each other? That could also get you at this kind of concept of intergenerational transmission of altruism. So lots to do, and that, I think, legacy will continue. Emily and many co-authors. I also like this paper a lot. It deals with a lot of things I've dealt with also. I'll just have a quick comment on method and then a few comments on findings. So if we're really interested in this causal estimate of housing wealth, we have actually also Michigan, must also have been a connection to Bob at some point. Mike Lovenheim was a Michigan grad student, but he had this amazing idea in many ways that during the run up to the Great Recession, we had this housing bubble, and he could argue that the changing home values was exogenous. It was sort of a lottery. You selected into a neighborhood and that by chance took off. That's sort of the definition of a bubble. It doesn't have to do with anything real. And that exogeneity, I thought, was really convincing. Once you leave the run up to the bubble, I think the exogeneity becomes a little more debatable. Others have used it to. Rucker has used the bursting of the bubble, the destruction of housing values. But to me, that's a little less convincing because there's just so much more going on, right? For example, in the recession. So what else? Other identification strategies, something I'm drawn to is, could you look at future changes in home values and aggregate income after the kid is out of college? And why is that? It could, one, be a placebo test, but there are also ways to include future changes in a treatment as actually to reduce bias. So I'd be happy to chat about that. On the findings, I think some really intriguing findings. We saw findings on the racial inequality in the wealth effects. Those are, of course, tricky, as you say, especially thanks to the distributional phenomenon here. Let's remember just the vastness of the racial wealth gap, which Emily alluded to, right? It's, for those who don't know, the average Black family in the US has less than 10 cents on the dollar of the white family. Or if you stack that up in dollar coins, Black wealth is about a 4-story apartment building, and white wealth is the Empire State Building. It's very drastic differences. Now, estimating the effects of this wealth on education is actually makes it very tricky. In my work, I've also often found there is no wealth effect for Black families. Of course, doesn't mean it's not important. In my work, at least, it's because there's barely any wealth among Black families. So whether average marginal effects are the right way to look at this, I actually don't know, but it's quite difficult to estimate. In terms of the racial differences in how wealth shapes educational expectations, that was intriguing too. And I will just underline, they're looking at expectations, not aspirations, right? It's very different concept. Black children, of course, aspire to go to college, but I think they know that the cards are stacked against them, right? And that's what you see in expectations. And these expectations may be quite rational. The lack of wealth suggests that you lack a safety net or the insurance function that Sarah referred to. That makes the college decision very different. That's a much riskier decision to go to college, may not work out, you get stuck with the student debt. What now if you don't have that insurance? So I think that's an important finding. And then I'll end with a sort of tongue-in-cheek moment. You have an interesting finding of a larger effect of wealth on graduation than on entry. So it's all about persistence, right? Keeping kids in college. And that's actually a really good finding that's also already produced in a great demography paper from 2018 titled Growing Wealth Gaps in Education that you're not citing. So since Kate kicked off this whole event with a comment about Bob being the nicest economist, I of course have to say, is that because that paper was written by a sociologist? Bob, of course, would never let disciplinary boundaries matter in this way. And also, I will say Bob was just the nicest person, and he was never petty, unlike me, the author of that 2018 paper.
Great, thank you, everyone. So we will take questions, and I see, okay, we'll do Vicky and then we'll do Barbara.
Hi, this is more of a statement, less of a question, sorry. When Linda and Mary Beth and I were first asked to put a day or an afternoon together to really pay tribute to our friend and colleague, we wanted an afternoon that would be inspiring. And I have to say, you have all truly inspired me to hear all about your research and how it stemmed from Bob and from his mentoring. It's exactly what I think we had hoped we would hear. And I want to thank you all for the beautiful way in which you paid tribute to him. I also wanted to share that Bob inspired me for the many years that I knew him. He continued to have idea after idea after idea. His illness did not affect that inspiration that he had to answer important questions. And seeing all of you sort of thread in his work into what, as a foundation for what you're working on, is sort of how I viewed him. And I wanted to particularly mention his work on COVID, which, as you know, COVID didn't hit until 2020. And Bob had such an appetite to answer questions about COVID. I mean, the rest of us were just trying to figure out, you know, kids and parents and not going to work and all of it. And he was like, no, I have this scientific agenda that I want to address. And Linda shared with me that at the same time, he decided that he needed to start touching the data again. He had always loved working with data, but he taught himself Stata in 2020 using eye gaze technology. And I just think that is just such an inspiration that he let his curiosity and his excitement about the science really stay with him right until the end. And I just wanted to share all that with you because I found it such an inspiration. So thank you all again. And I will turn the mic back over. I wasn't on the program, but.
Hi, my question's for Adriana, and I found your paper very interesting, but I wondered about a couple of things. And maybe I heard it wrong, and maybe you were going to do it anyway. But as I heard, you are looking at both money and non-money transfers from parents to children, and you're only looking at non-money transfers from children. And that could have been because there weren't so many of them. But also I think that there may be an issue with you taking the onset of a health problem as the time to look at it. And maybe when the parent, first has a problem, you can do it by that. And maybe when it persists a little longer, it's a question of paying for care to come in regularly. And that I think you should look at both kinds of it. And I mean, the paper you presented was really interesting. I'm asking like further things. But I think that looking at money transfers later would be valuable. But also I thought about another thing that I'm not totally sure how it works out, but I think it has something to do with it. That you said how the parents are more likely to give aid, and I think financial aid, to more needy children than to less needy children. And so if being needy when they are younger means less income and wealth when they're older, the children that didn't get help would be the best financially off to help their parents when they need help later. And so, I mean, that's just sensible. And I was wondering if you had or had thought about looking at the issue of, simultaneously about behavior of all the eligible children and whether, whether something like this is actually happening. And if it is, and if the effects is strong, it could, to some extent, distort some of the findings when you look at one child at a time. But thank you very much.
Thanks for your questions. So to the first part, we did initially look at transfers, like financial transfers to parents, and there is a question on whether or not children help pay for care, but it is relatively less common than this type of support. And so we kind of set that aside for now, but I think it is a great point that, we should probably also look at this as we continue on in this work. And because as I said, we did initially look at it, and, I can't exactly remember what we found, but again, we did look at it and I think it was relatively small. And so I think we just kind of set it aside for now, but probably good to return to that. So thanks for that point and suggestion. And then to the second point about thinking about the within family dynamics of this, and that, if parents are more likely to give to the more needy child, then maybe that child would be, I think certainly less able financially to help later in life. So kind of pointing back to this, looking at the financial support that's given to parents, which again, it is less common. I think that is likely, possible, it's not necessarily, and so it's unclear, I guess, how it would affect the care receipt in terms of whether or not those children would, on one hand, the children who are more well off also might be, and some of my other work might have more education, be likely to live further away and be less available for care. And so it's kind of hard to know exactly how that relationship might work for the receipt of care. And there has been some work that has looked at this within, to care, the transfers within families, and they do find, as we mentioned, that care is more, or help is more likely to go to those children who have more needs. But again, I would have to look at this and think about this more, to think about how that also might change over the life courses. We're looking at this care that's given later in the life course. And so the children might have been more needy when they were receiving the help, but that doesn't necessarily mean they are when the help is needed. And so I guess, in thinking about those life course dynamics, but definitely great things to follow up on in future research and think more about. So thanks for those suggestions.
Do you have any other questions in the room?
Hi, thanks for these papers. They're really, really important topics and really interesting analysis. I think there's some further work that you might be very well set up to do, sort of, and this kind of dog that didn't bark transfers. So I think that the amount of intergenerational insurance might be understated by looking at what actually gets transferred. So there's a lot of insurance late in life, particularly against need for long-term care, by having home equity. So if someone dies without having high care needs, then there will be perhaps substantial assets to transfer. Most for middle class, most likely the house. But in the unfortunate event that there's a need for care, the house gets sold, the home equity gets eaten up in late in life care. So it might be interesting to sort of look at sort of absence of bequests, or predicting the extent to which bequests are lower than they might have been had there not been sort of adverse health outcomes. I think both the PSID and sort of the HRS exit interviews would be really useful for this.
Thanks for that suggestion. Again, definitely something to think about as we go forward with this line of research. So thank you.
Are there any other questions? Because if not, I'll turn it back to Mary Beth. Thank you all for your contributions today. So thank you.
Well, I guess this concludes our symposium. I just want to thank all of the presenters, the discussants, and the chairs, session chairs, for such a fabulous and very thought-provoking symposium today. And thank all of you for attending, including those on Zoom. I think at one point I counted 70 people or something on Zoom, at least. So tremendous turnout, such a tribute to Bob, our great friend and colleague. And so thank you to everyone.